If we think back to, let's start with February of 2020, before all of this was really hitting the US economy. And then we were really thinking that we were going to have a fairly normal economic environment, that maybe we were fairly close to full employment, GDP growth was moderate, everything looked pretty good. And then COVID hit. And all of a sudden we shifted from thinking about a world where some of our biggest concerns were that the economy was not growing as robustly as we would have liked, and we were concerned about inequality. And then all of a sudden we were concerned about huge economic collapse in the US and around the world. So these days, some of the big economic topics that people are talking about is people are very concerned about prices rising more quickly than we've seen in a long time. And we're also seeing an interesting event where we still have in the US about 5 million fewer jobs than we had pre-pandemic, but we're at the same time seeing that we've got a record number of vacancies of jobs open, and employers are really reporting that they're having a hard time filling those roles. So there's a lot of shifts happening in the economy right now, and trying to figure out how much of this is temporary, how much of it is permanent, is really where everybody's sitting at in terms of research right now. Well, one word that keeps coming up over and over again when describing our economic conditions is unprecedented. That was true in March of 2020. That remains true today. So it's very hard for policymakers to make decisions because a lot of what they're basing their forecasts on is going to be on historical precedent and experiences we've had in the past. And if we haven't seen anything like this before, it's much harder to come up with good policy prescriptions. And so we see, a lot of different policies being thrown out there right now, and there's a lot of uncertainty about those policies. And one of the challenges for decision makers is that uncertainty. So not knowing what the policies are going to look like slows down the decisions that businesses are willing to make, because they're like, well, wait, if I wait a couple of months, maybe the economic landscape is going to be significantly different, so I probably shouldn't put a lot of money into one project right now. And that's one of the big concerns that I have going forward, is what's going to happen with just clarifying what policy is going to look like and making it as clear as we possibly can in a very uncertain environment. Well, so on the one hand, obviously every bit and drop of data is being mined just mercilessly by everyone, from every decision maker, from households to firms to stock market traders to all sorts of policymakers. And what's really exciting is there are all sorts of different kinds of data coming in that we didn't have pre-pandemic. So we've got the Google mobility data, we've got Indeed's job posting data, we've got data on open table reservations, we've got all these different sorts of data that can tell us what's happening, but none of them have a really long track record. And so that's one of the challenges, is that a lot of these data that we're using to make our forecasts and our predictions, they have performed pretty well in terms of thinking about the downturn. But we're not quite so sure what they're going to tell us about how things are going to be going forward. And so, on the one hand, all this data is precious, and we're trying to just really hoover in every bit of data. And that's something that we know from forecast evaluation research, is that when times are uncertain, you need to bring in as much data as possible. You can use a much simpler model in normal times, but we're clearly not in normal times. So if you're bringing in all that data, it's great and you're excited, but at the same time, there's a wide range of potential failures of these forecasts. So we have to make forward-looking decisions, and we have to also recognize that the information that we're building off of might not be giving us a very good picture of the future. We have so many different issues going on at one time, but if we think about the supply chains, that is actually another example of so many different pieces having to get along together. And one of the things that we've really realized is that the shift towards just-in-time manufacturing, where we were really each piece of the chain only ordered the part that they needed when they knew they had an order for the part that they were producing, and they built on like that, that was really great when things were smooth and stable and we could predict our demand pretty well. The minute we enter into a very uncertain environment, this approach really, really fails. And it's going to be hard to bring that back online, and it might be pretty costly. We may have to think about maintaining a little bit more in terms of inventories and really potentially shifting some of these models for how we're going to produce longer term. And that's going to cost some economic growth potentially to make those shifts. And nobody likes that idea very much. Well, first of all, I will acknowledge that I looked a lot to my political science colleagues for the bigger political picture. But obviously, there is a clear interplay between economic decisions and political decisions. So on the one hand, as an economist, I'll say some political decisions are not feasible because they're too economically costly. But on the other hand, some economic decisions we'd like to have that would seem very clear from economic theory. One example might be carbon taxes for addressing climate change. That may not be feasible politically. And so we do have this back and forth conversation that we constantly have to have. And when those political alliances are shifting, that can add an extra wrench in the economic wheels as well. One interesting thing that we've seen is that in a lot of ways, things have been quite a bit better from the labor market perspective than what economists initially would have predicted. We thought that the recession would last a lot longer after the initial shock of the pandemic than it did. In fact, the National Bureau of Economic Research that dates our recessions said that the recession bottomed out in April of 2020. So we've actually been in recovery since then. And we now see that the unemployment rate in the US is still higher than it was pre-pandemic, and we still have about 5 million people fewer employed than what we had pre-pandemic. But at the same time, we're really hearing from lots and lots of employers across a wide range of industries that they are really struggling to find employees. And in fact, that they're having to raise wages significantly. And so interestingly, on the side, as some of the work that I do with Indeed, they've run surveys to ask job seekers, what is holding you back from looking for a job, more urgently. And what people have said is initially, a few months ago, it was still health concerns. There was still concern about the exposure to the Delta variant. But more recently, people have shifted and said, well, I just don't need to look for a job quite yet. One of the top reasons people have given is because their spouse has paid employment at the moment. And so they can focus on care for children, care for the home, taking their time looking for another job. So they don't need to look urgently. So we are seeing this shift that's really shifting from more health concerns to more thinking about their financial position and also their job satisfaction. And so that suggests that we are in this transition where, assuming there's not another health shock coming down the line, that people will be coming back to the workforce as employers offer more appealing jobs and conditions. And that just takes time as we shift through all of this. So if you think about it, it's actually a lot like the broader supply chain issues, that we've had this huge shock and shift in our economy broadly. And so in our supply of goods, we're seeing difficulties in figuring out how to get that supply chain restarted. And we're also seeing that in terms of the supply of labor. If we think about prices, on the other hand, this is an area where forecasters have really been surprised and kind of continue to be surprised. We keep seeing forecast errors where we're beating expectations, where prices are growing faster than forecasters expected. And this is an area where we keep pushing out the horizon for how long prices are going to be growing quickly. Initially we thought it was just a brief shock as people were going out and spending again, and there was too much demand, too little supply, but just in a very short-term pocket. The Fed would call it transitory. But then they've really backed off from that, and now forecasters are moving out. And so, if we think about what that means for political decisions, a lot of people are really, really concerned about what's happening with faster price growth. But at the same time, we're also seeing faster wage growth. And what we can typically see is that wage growth can be very persistent. Like once you get a raise, it's really hard for an employer to take that back. But prices tend to shift around a bit more. And so one potential outcome of this intersection between the labor market and prices is that we might see some wage growth that really helps people, particularly at the lower end of the wage spectrum. And it comes at a cost of higher prices for a little while, but things then settle down, but people have a permanent higher wage rate. There's real hope there that all of these adjustments might work to bring us a healthier, stronger labor market coming out of it. One thing that's really interesting, if you think about economic forecasters, everything that they do is built on history and their experience. If we think about the data that goes into forecasting models, we're using historical data series. And so really the only things that we can predict with those sorts of models is things that look like historical events. And so oftentimes we talk about how policy is built to fight the last recession. And if you think about the Great Depression, that's really where macroeconomic research even began, was thinking about the Great Depression and potential policy responses to that. And we've done that with every recession since. And so what's really interesting is if we think about what's happening in the policy world in response to the pandemic, it's a lot of policy that was built after we learned from the Great Recession, from the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. We brought those policies out, even though completely different causes, right? But we made sure we weren't going to also have a financial crisis along with a global pandemic. And I think that was really, really important that we did that, and that did really prevent another financial crisis. But it's not the same, and that's the problem with addressing recessions, and the problem with predicting recessions is that they do always come from a different source. And so with a different source, there might be different appropriate policy responses. But in general, we don't predict recessions in advance. We only, some of the best forecasters are just able to recognize when they're first starting. That's pretty late for doing forward-looking policy. So we already have to have basically some guns loaded. And so that's really what we're looking at for policy. And we're going to learn a lot from this one. And we're going to have whatever the next recession is caused by, we're probably going to have some pandemic response type policy plans for that. But if we think about on the recovery side, this is an area where we really expected that there might be some slowness to this recovery. There were basically two camps coming into thinking about the economic recovery from the pandemic. There was the V camp, the camp that was like, hey, this was a really deep cut in the economy, but we're going to bounce right back. And then there was the really extremely pessimistic camp, like the L camp, where they're like, you know what, we've just dug this big hole and now we're just going to keep digging forward and we're never really going to see a really robust recovery. Some of that pessimism came from our really slow slog of a recovery out of the Great Recession. People thought, okay, our last recovery was really slow and awful, so this one is probably going to be really slow and awful as well. And in fact, I was fairly pessimistic early on. But we've actually seen that there was at least a substantial portion of a V. And now people are describing this recovery as being more of a reverse radical situation where you can see we dipped down, came up, but now we're still struggling to bring back all of the employment. But on the GDP side, we're pretty much back at pre-pandemic levels, perhaps even close to pre-pandemic.
Sure. My name is Professor Tara Sinclair. I am the chair of the Department of Economics here at the George Washington University. And I previously worked as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Macroeconomics in the Biden administration in the Treasury. And I also was the founding chief economist of the Indeed hiring lab at Indeed, the job search site. And 4.3% as a unemployment rate is still historically pretty low. And so that's reassuring about where the macroeconomic aggregates are today. At the same time, that direction of change, that increase over time, is concerning. And in particular, is that a signal that the labor market is going to continue to deteriorate? If so, then we do want to see some easing of monetary policy. But it's been moving so slowly that it may be more of a sign of relative stabilization rather than deterioration. Typically, it does tend to start out kind of slow, but then really pick up speed, because at first what we do tend to see is that people have a harder time finding jobs. And that's the point that we are in the economy right now, is that people who are looking for jobs are not finding them at the same pace as before. However, it's not yet the case that we're seeing really dramatic layoffs or people losing their jobs. And that's really when things take off. And so what we're trying to distinguish right now, and I think this is exactly what Chair Powell and the other members of the FOMC are discussing perhaps right at this moment, is how much of this signal from the labor market is really an early warning sign of something much worse, versus just saying, hey, we've had a really good run, and now things kind of naturally slow down a bit, but won't necessarily tumble into into a recession. The first myth that always comes to mind when everybody is talking about the job market, particularly for young people, is around job hopping. Now, of course, now might not be the right time to job hop because there aren't as many new opportunities out there. However, at the same time, there are some. And I think people often hear, and I don't know where this advice comes from. I'd really like to go and nip that in the bud. But the advice is that, oh, your first job, you need to stay there for at least a year or two because you don't want to be categorized as a job hopper, as if that's something bad about you. Or people will complain like, oh, young people these days, they're such job hoppers. Well, young people have always been job hoppers. That's actually a really good thing for young people to do, to go try a job that they think they might be a good fit for. And if not, look for another job. When you find it, hop. And that's a really good thing to do, not just for you individually, but why would you want to stay with an employer where you don't feel like you're a good fit? That's not good for you. That's not good for the employer. That's not good for the aggregate macroeconomy either, because in general, when you're at a better fit, you're happier, you're more productive, and that's a win-win-win. Well, and so I will try not to be an Indeed commercial right now, but they did just launch a couple of new products that are called, I think the broader product is called Scout, but they have one that's for recruiters and one that's for job seekers. And my interpretation of the vision, and again, I don't work for Indeed anymore, so this is like, if I did work for Indeed, this is what I would be trying to pitch to them, is that people always complain about resumes. They're so flat. People look at them so quickly. They don't characterize who you are, all of your knowledge, skills, interests. You just can't communicate that in a piece of paper. And so if you think about that, I think someday we're going to look back at resumes and be like, oh my gosh, that is such a dystopian way to find a job. Just one piece of paper and somebody judges you and says like, oh, we'll interview this person or not. And so the new way, I think where we're going with AI, is to be able to train an AI persona to have much more of a robust representation of who you are. And you can tell it more about your hopes, your dreams, your career ambitions, but also all of your past experiences in much, much greater detail than would ever get considered in a resume. And then that persona, that bot, can go out and represent you. And yes, it might be talking to a bot on the other side too, but that way that just saves everybody time. And ideally, if done well, also removes the biases that humans often bring and tries to find better matches. And so that's just the first stage. It's not like the other bot on the other side is going to be like, you're hired, and then you're stuck with whatever job your bot picked for you, right? That's just going to get you through that resume review stage. But I think we tried for a while video resumes to try and give some more like dimension, and that didn't really work very well. I really do think AI and these sorts of personas could be quite helpful if done well. And there might be some challenges in the transition, but I'm excited about that technology. Yeah. Well, and I think that's another common myth that you see that kind of filters through young people's experience of the job market more generally. Just like when we're young, we only hear about a small number of types of jobs. And then here at the university, oftentimes we only hear about a small number of types of firms. And we tend to think about those really big firms as being like, oh, I want to go to McKinsey, or I want to go to Goldman, or like, you hear maybe some of those sorts of firms. But at the same time, if you really want to get a variety in your day and want to explore a lot of things, a small firm is so fantastic. So my first job out of college that I really sunk my teeth into was I was a real estate appraiser in Chicago, and I worked for a small family real estate appraisal firm. And I started at the front desk. I was doing super basic background research for reports. But because it was a small company, they started pulling me into other things. I got to do some accounting. I got to do some work in the real estate appraisal field, and eventually got training and became a real estate appraiser myself. And that was something that was possible because it was a small firm. Whereas larger firms, they have much more tracked positions. And so I think particularly for people who are like, well, I don't really know what I'm good at or what I'd like to do, maybe look at the small companies. I was in my 20s out of college. So yeah, I graduated from undergrad, and then I worked for 4 years between undergrad and doing my PhD.
Your experience as a student, as a PhD, different than when you were an undergrad?
Oh, absolutely. It's a completely different experience. And so another misperception is a lot of people think, okay, grad school, it's going to be more debt. I'm going to have to pay more tuition. And that is true in some areas. But typically, if you're pursuing a PhD, it comes with a job. And so you're not just paying tuition. You're not a student anymore. Life happens while you're pursuing a PhD. You're getting a small salary. You have a job. You have an office. Typically, maybe you're sharing it with other people, but that's often the case in entry-level jobs. You share an office or share a space. And so I loved being a PhD student, and I watched my classmates settle down, have families, all while pursuing their PhD. And so I think some people are turned off of pursuing a PhD because they think that it's going to make them have to wait until they're in their 30s before they can start their lives. And that's not at all true. It is an entry-level job already. Yes. So we do have a PhD program in the economics department. So I think we have about 60 students total in our PhD program. So we've got a lot of PhD students running around the building. And I typically supervise one or so a year. That's my main PhD student that I'm putting on the job market, looking for typically some kind of academic research position.
What's like the main topic the lab is researching currently?
Well, so I run, I used to. Now things have changed since this academic year, but I, for a very long time, ran our research program on forecasting. It's named after Herman Steckler, who was a colleague of mine. And so we focused on all issues around economic forecasting, with a particular specialization in evaluating how forecasts are produced and how that way that forecasts are produced affect decision making.
Oh, decision making for
any forward-looking decision. I like to focus on the Fed. So a lot of my research has looked at how forecasts have affected Fed policy decisions.
Oh, what was the specific indicators you were looking at?
Well, so I could get really deep into the weeds here. I'll try to not go completely off the rails here. But as I mentioned to you before, the Fed's got to make forward-looking monetary policy. And so they're trying to make decisions where the decision today is not going to have an impact for 6 months or a year. So they want to know what the economy is going to look like a year down the line. And so they have a large team of researchers inside the Federal Reserve Board that their main job is producing forecasts that are considered to be the staff forecasts that are then fed up to the Federal Open Market Committee members. And those staff forecasts are really a critical input to policy decision making. And I think that might even be more important than the summary of economic projections that also come from the FOMC participants themselves. But in any case, all of this information is really critical for thinking about how do we make a decision about interest rates 6, 9, 12 months, or in terms of what they're going to, how they're going to impact the economy down the line. So we have to think about what the labor market is going to look like, not what it looks like today, but what it's going to look like a year from now. And it's a really hard job. I mean, we like to think about things being very straightforward and just being like, well, the Fed should know what the labor market's going to look like a year from now. And yes, they've spent a lot of time building up models, and they've got a lot of resources they're putting at it. And I think that they are basically the best in the world at forecasting the U.S. economy. Mm-hmm. And there's still a lot of uncertainty, particularly at a time like right now.
Yeah. Because events can happen.
Exactly. All sorts of things can happen. I mean, and there's just so many policy changes. I mean, basically, how do they produce these forecasts? They're looking at the past. So in order for us to be able to forecast the future well, the future needs to look like the past.
Which is not
That's
always.
Not really what we're thinking right now. The U.S. economy really looks to be shifting. I mean, if it weren't for all the policy changes, we'd be talking about all the AI impacts. That's shifting things around. But in addition, we also have to figure out what tariff policies are going to look like, what immigration policies are going to look like. And we don't have a clear historical comparison where we had AI and tariffs and restricted immigration all at the same time to be able to come up with any kind of analogy to help us accurately forecast the future. Yeah, so one of the key things that macroeconomic forecasters tend to focus on is that in normal times, you only need to really track a few indicators. Everything's kind of going in the same direction, so you can just track a small number of things. And in fact, really just tracking the recent history of a particular variable. Let's say you wanted to track GDP growth. You could just look back and be like, okay, well, what was GDP growth last year? It's probably going to be similar this year. Mm-hmm. And that works in normal times. But then the minute the economy is trying to shift in some way, and of course, COVID was a huge shock to the economy, well, then you need to look at all the indicators to get a better read. And in fact, this is what we did. So I was working part-time at Indeed at the time of the pandemic. And so one of our big motivators to put out data to the public was, as we saw the labor market turning, we realized that we needed much more frequent data on what was happening in the labor market. And we needed that data in the hands of policymakers so that they could make better decisions about things like extending unemployment insurance benefits and targeting policies for helping families that were being impacted by the pandemic. Because if we waited and only got the jobs numbers once a month, they weren't going to have a good read on how fast things were changing. And so we put together what we ended up calling our Policy Partners Project, where, so it was our own PPP, if you will, where we put out data and got it in the hands of like the Federal Reserve System and also central banks around the world, because this wasn't just a U.S. shock. It was affecting everybody. And so while other people were, looking at what was going on with the virus and vaccines, we were looking at trying to provide information to support the labor market. I have a new working paper that I'm really excited about that I'll just briefly mention to you, which is, so it's actually using AI for macroeconomic research. And so what we've done, it's with my co-author, Sophia Kasnick at Stanford. And we have AI personas for each of the FOMC members. So we're simulating the Fed with AI. And this allows us to see, if we give them different information, how the FOMC decisions might change. And this is something that we could never do research on before. Like, it's very hard to do experiments in economics because, we don't have rats, we don't have atoms, it's people. And particularly in the macroeconomy, perhaps I could go to the FOMC members and give them a survey and say, hey, if you had known about the July employment data before your July meeting, would you have made a different decision? But it's very hard to get humans to put themselves back in that time. Whereas with AI personas, we can train them with just the information up to that moment, give them that one additional piece of information, and see how their behavior changes. And so we've been building this sandbox, and it's really fun.